graduate school of education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Courier Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum, and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She's taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, more recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her organization, Culturally Curious's mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. So tonight, she will be discussing John Singer Sargent. The title of tonight's program is John Singer Sargent, Master with a Brush. John Singer Sargent, a masterful 19th century artist, is celebrated for his grand manner portraiture of the European and American elite. This program will explore his most beloved as well as rarely seen images, including portraits, forays into Impressionism, and stunning watercolors. So this promises to be a wonderful evening of people in beautiful clothes, right, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I will hand it over now. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We are in for such a treat because these images are just some of the most beautiful ever created, and I have brought a lot of them, so I'll be moving quickly through these images, but I just wanted to start off with a quick note about sort of my personal connection with Sargent. And I feel like a lot of people in New England have a personal connection with Sargent. Many of you probably remember the summer of Sargent, 1999, when there was a big blockbuster exhibition at the MFA. Many of his works were assembled. And I believe they had, several 100,000 people go through that exhibition. And that was really my first taste of him. I think I was sort of a new art history major in college. And shortly after that, after I graduated, I went and worked for the Boston Public Library Foundation, where we raised money to restore his murals at the library. And then after that, I went on and I became a museum teacher at the Gardner for several years, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. So Sargent has like a huge place in my mind and in my heart. And so I'm so excited to share him with you tonight. And so it really will be delving into a lot of beautiful images of beautiful people. So we'll start off with these ladies up here on the screen. And let's look at the full picture here. This is the Windham sisters, painted in 1899. I think of this as like the very height of John Singer Sargent and his capabilities, and sort of like the epitome of what he was capable of doing. So of course we have these three gorgeous women in these lovely sort of shiny gowns who are just sort of like lazing about. There's not a lot of vitality to these women. They're lounging. They almost seem slightly bored, but certainly everything about this picture is designed to show their wealth, their elegance, and you may notice that the composition is a little bit unusual. This is a very large picture. It's about 9.5 feet tall by 7 feet wide. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and you'll notice that Sargent took up really only about the bottom third of the picture with these women in these white gowns, and the rest of the picture is sort of given over to shadow and darkness. But what we are supposed to notice is this portrait of their mother up on the wall behind them. So in addition to their wealth and elegance, he's sort of tapping into their elite genealogy in this case. So there's a lot of sort of coded layers to Sargent's work. But I wanted to just, before we even delve into Sargent himself, just show how different this is from the kind of family portraiture that came before it. And so the image that I have on the left here is painted by the American artist Charles Willson Peale. It's a depiction of his own family, and it's almost 100 years before Sargent. But I bring this image in just to remind us that typically speaking, when we're creating an image of our family, something that we want to remember our family by, typically there's a closeness, there's a family connection that's represented. There's warmth, there's smiles, and perhaps there's some suggestion of sort of intellectual interest, or even some suggestion of wealth, but really when you compare these two images, it's really apples and oranges to me, because there's so much warmth and humanity to the faces and the interpersonal connections in the Charles Willson Peale family portrait versus the sort of guarded, sort of bored expressions of the Windham sisters on the right. But I should say that the Windham sisters were received with sort of glowing praise. The Prince of Wales even dubbed them the Three Graces. It was just considered such an incredible, sort of over-the-top, beautiful picture when it debuted right around the turn of the century. So before we dive in, let me give you the roadmap of how we're going to navigate all of this. This will be about an hour-long program, and we'll start off with an introduction to John Singer Sargent, very briefly touch on his biography, and then talk about his early career, how he got started. Consider him as a cultural chameleon because he sort of dabbled in several different styles. And then think about how he kind of launched this incredible career in portraiture by having friends in all the right places. And then he wants to take his career in a totally different direction and create some major masterworks. And so we'll look at those really ambitious projects, or a few of them at least. Touch on his watercolors that he really focused on at the end of his career, and then consider where his legacy stands today. The image that I have up here on the right, I just had to include because she is my absolute favorite John Singer Sargent portrait. This is Lady Agnew of Lochnaw, painted in 1892. And I sort of have to give a caveat here with some of these portraits. They're all stunning, they're all beautiful, but there isn't much to talk about with many of these figures beyond how it's painted. So we could get into, who this person married or what their royal title was or something like that. But I think that takes us a little bit too far away from John Singer Sargent and his work. So for the most part, I'm going to include a lot of these beautiful pictures for us to admire, but we won't get too far into who the subjects are. But I had to show this. I love the masterful way he's painted this kind of lilac sash, but what I love most about this picture in particular is the directness of her gaze and sort of the sense that you have that she was engaged in conversation, and she's maybe even judging you just a little bit. You don't get that in many of his portraits. So I will be using these lovely, stunning portraits, mostly of women, as sort of place markers throughout the program as we explore the rest of his career too. So the woman I have up here, this portrait is Mrs. Henry White from 1882, and she's at the National Gallery of Art in DC. And again, the dress here is just unbelievable, and the virtuosity and how it's painted. We can see these broad strokes of white, but yet at the same time, our eyes and our minds tell us that it is, it's satin or it's shimmering. So with every portrait, we're reminded of his virtuoso skill. And of course, as we're thinking about the beginning of his career, I bring in his quote, the thicker you paint, the more it flows. And this is a great thing for us to keep in mind when it comes to John Singer Sargent, because he is an artist who was known for just loading up his brush with paint and just going directly to the canvas. And we'll talk about how that's a little bit different than other artists working around the same time. So a young John Singer Sargent, he was born in 1856. This is him at 11 years old on the left, and on the right at age 18. And he was born in Florence to American parents who were already sort of living as expatriate nomads, moving about Europe, and they essentially decided to educate him by just taking him to the best museums throughout Europe. So he had this incredible sort of multinational education, and he began to excel in things like the arts and music, and showed a real interest in literature. He became fluent in not just in English, but in French, Italian, and in German. And he showed from a very early age a real interest in the arts. So he began to receive drawing lessons and watercolor lessons from his mother, and they decided that this is really sort of where he should go in terms of his future. So these two images here are self-portraits, both self-portraits. The one on the left is from 1886. So this is when John Singer Sargent was about 20 years old. And the one on the right is from when he's about 50 years old. So what happens after that? He goes on to be essentially the greatest portrait painter of his time, and we'll delve into sort of how he got his formal education. But I think just sort of big picture for us to keep in mind is he has almost a 50-year career, and during that time he paints about 900 oil paintings and over 2,000 watercolor paintings. So he was prolific and extremely well regarded for the bulk of his career, the bulk of his lifetime. And just like his parents, he continued to live this expatriate lifestyle. He just bounced around Europe and never really settled down and called one place home, but he did have very strong connections to the city of Boston. And we'll talk about his travels a little bit. He lives to the age of 69 and then dies peacefully in his sleep of cardiovascular disease. As he was aging, he got bigger and bigger and bigger, and because he was sort of a celebrity, famous, all the cartoonists of the age were always sort of making fun of his ever-expanding waistline. The poor guy. But I think that means he was living very well. So we're going to go back to the very beginning of his career and sort of see how he got started. So he had begun his formal training as an artist in Italy, but his parents moved to Paris in 1874, basically a year after he got started. And in Paris, he enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the premier place for an art education. And then he also began to study under the artist that you see here in the photograph on the left, whose name was Carolus Duran. And just to give you a sense of Carolus Duran, this is a portrait that he painted on the right. So John Singer Sargent was getting two very different educations. At the École des Beaux-Arts, they're focusing on things like drawing and anatomy and perspective. It was very regimented. And Carolus Duran, who was quickly becoming one of the most successful and popular portrait painters in Paris at the time, he really focused on just loading up your paintbrush and going directly to the canvas. There's no preparatory drawings. It's really just applying paint to canvas. This is called the A La Prima Method. And this is sort of, he wasn't the first person to ever do this. This is something that artists have done for centuries, but it tends to have what art historians, the effect is sort of what art historians call kind of this buttery brushwork. So with Carolus Duran, and then what we'll see with Sargent, is a lot of realism around the face, but then usually with the torso or the clothing, there tends to be these really thick, visible brushstrokes that are just kind of alluring. And so Sargent begins to study under Carolus Duran and immediately becomes the star pupil. And he adopts his style and achieves great success with it early on. So what we see here on the right now is Sargent's painting of his teacher. And this is located in Massachusetts at the Clark Art Institute in Western Mass. This was painted in 1879. So Sargent was just 23 years old when he painted this. It always makes me go back and think, what was I achieving at 23 years old? And so obviously it's a stunning representation of his teacher here. There's the realism around the face. There's the painterly way he laid in the jacket here. So So he's really showing with this portrait that he has kind of absorbed all of his master's lessons here, and he's kind of ready to take off. And so there's even the inscription along the top that basically said, you know, how much he admires him, and it's signed like your affectionate pupil. So he has, you know, great success early on, but when it comes to Sargent, there's always a critic. So we'll see a few cartoons throughout where you can see that the critics sort of come after him for anything. And in this case, the cartoon here sort of indicating that he made his master, in this case, look a little bit demonic, perhaps, or a little bit satanic. So switching gears, we're going to talk about Sargent as a cultural chameleon. And I sort of came up with this term for him because he's an artist that kind of tries on a lot of different hats and kind of integrates all of it a little bit into what becomes his signature style. And so we've got this gorgeous portrait of another woman here. In this case, her name is Betty Wertheimer. This is from 1908. It's in the collection of the Smithsonian. I love how painterly the dress is in this case, particularly right around her knee, and the sense of the shininess of the material here. And so our quote is, "No small dabs of color, you want plenty of paint to paint with." And so again, it's this idea that main lesson that he learns from his master is really guiding him through. So as I mentioned, Sargent was as much of a nomad as his parents were. And right after his early success in Paris, he actually travels to Northern Africa, and he travels all around there. I believe he goes to Morocco, he goes to Tangier, and this was really the major work to come out of those travels and his first major work on his own as an artist. This is actually also in the Clark Art Institute's collection, and it dates to 1880. It's generally known as the Smoke of Ambergris. So what we're looking at here is a model that Sargent had hired and came to the house that he had rented. So we sort of get a sense of who this is and where this is. And she is standing over this like little silver censer here. And what she's doing is she's inhaling this kind of perfumed smoke of ambergris, which comes from a substance that's extracted from whales. And sometimes it's used in religious ceremonies, but it's also said to have this kind of aphrodisiac, it's like an aphrodisiac. So there's kind of this sensual quality embedded in this just because of the name and the activity here. So he sketched this all out, and then he brought everything back to his studio and finished the work there, and then sort of debuted it to a European audience. And so you can sort of think of this as like a fantasy of what Africa might be like for Western eyes. And the public really loved it. There was one critic in 1880 who referred to it quite simply as a perfect piece of painting. And other critics who really got into like the fantasy of who this woman is and this kind of ceremonial rite that she's involved in. So one of the things that made this a particularly exceptional painting for the time is that there was, believe it or not, a real craze in the art world in the late 19th century for paintings, for white on white paintings, as they're sort of known today. So the image that I have here on the left is by another American expatriate artist, James McNeill Whistler. You're probably familiar with him because of the painting of Whistler's mother, the old lady in the rocking chair. Well, this is one of the most scandalous pictures that Whistler ever painted of this woman in a white dress in front of a white background. And that's essentially what Sargent has given us on the right. And when you think about it, you know, it's like, well, it sounds dull, but if somebody tasked you with creating a picture and said, I'm really limiting you here to just maybe grays, creams, and whites, that's a nearly impossible task. So it's kind of a virtuoso activity, just limiting your palette in that way. But Sargent does not stay on that track at all. The next place he travels to is Spain. And he spends a lot of time exploring Spain and the Prado Museum, and there's a lot of Spanish art history that is really interested in these kind of inky black paintings. And so you get an image like this inspired by this trip to Spain. This is El Jaleo, and it dates to 1882. And this is an image that's probably really familiar to most of you because it's right down in Boston at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And before they got their nice new addition, this was the first work that you would see when you walked through the doors, and it's huge. I believe it's about 11 feet wide, and John Singer Sargent painted this when he was just 26 years old. So what we're looking at here is a flamenco dancer and the musicians and other dancers lined up in chairs along the wall behind her. And the title of the painting, El Jaleo, roughly means the ruckus or the uproar. And so when I used to give tours of the Gardner Museum, we would always say, this is the loudest painting in Boston. What are some of the sounds you hear coming out of this? And so people would always, look to the guitars and the clapping, and maybe imagine the stamping of her feet and maybe castanets in her hand. But it's really this guy here, right at the center, who many people mistake as being asleep. He is the singer in this scene, and he is just wailing at this moment. So you can really just imagine a cacophony of sound when you look at this. But it's such a visually striking image because of this dancer in the foreground, this dramatic pose, her arms sort of twisting backwards like this, and that strong diagonal of just her whole body kind of slicing through the picture. So John Singer Sargent, like I said, was traveling through Spain. He was kind of absorbing the lessons of Spanish masters that came before him, like Diego Velázquez, who was a Baroque artist and sort of, he was like the master of the Spanish Golden Age. So he has a great deal of work represented in the Prado Museum. And so these are the kinds of works that John Singer Sargent would have seen while he was traveling around. And again, I look at this and I almost think of black on black painting, particularly when you see this figure over here. Again, if somebody were to ask you to paint a picture of a man wearing multiple layers of black clothing and just hand you black paint, it would be really difficult to show. So Sargent was absorbing some of Diego Velázquez's lessons while he was in Spain. The other piece of this picture, which I love so much, is that when Sargent was in Spain, he had the opportunity to go to caves where man had been painting. And he includes a little bit of that in this picture. I'm going to zoom in here. And you can see that he painted like a bison or a buffalo on the wall here, and even like a little red handprint. These are all sort of references to those prehistoric cave paintings. And then on the other side of the picture, just above these other dancers who are waiting to probably go on stage themselves, you can see that he painted the word ole, ole, ole several times on the back of the wall. I don't know that he paints words into any of his other pictures. This is really interesting, but it adds to this sense of what a loud and boisterous picture this is. I just love it. So here he's imbuing all these lessons from the Spanish masters, and then just a few years later, he brightens his palette and he heads up to France, and he's working with the Impressionist masters. So what we're looking at here is John Singer Sargent's painting of Claude Monet, like the ultimate Impressionist master, who's working outside en plein air, as the French say, with his canvas and his easel and his paint palette here. This is Monet's wife, who's either very patient or very bored in the background. And we actually can date this picture because I think we know which painting Claude Monet was working on in John Singer Sargent's painting. So this dates to about 1885. And John Singer Sargent's hanging out with Monet and even trying out a little bit of the Impressionist style. So now you can see really short broken brushwork in the trees up above and in the grass down below. And in artistic circles at this time, it was a tradition that if you painted a portrait or a picture that included another artist, you would give that picture to them as a gift. Artists were always exchanging work in this way. But apparently, Sargent was so proud of this work, or maybe so proud of the fact that he was hanging out with Claude Monet, that he kept this painting for himself for the rest of his life. There are several other works that he created right around this time that really show an affinity for what Claude Monet was doing. And it's interesting because most art historians would never really categorize John Singer Sargent as an impressionist, but here we really see him dabbling in the style. I love this picture. This is two women essentially asleep in a boat underneath a willow tree. This dates to 1887. Again, these short broken brush strokes, visible brush strokes that we see in the willow tree and in the grass. And it seems to be like a direct reference to the kind of thing that Claude Monet was painting in the same year. Monet's picture is called The Boat. So we have that same kind of strong diagonal created by the boats, and then the loose impressionist brushstrokes of the vegetation all around. And then you have this gorgeous picture, another picture by Sargent in this case, of another artist, an American artist, I believe, named Paul Helieu, sketching with his wife. And this is in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It dates to 1889. So we have Sargent kind of working, dabbling in Impressionism over the course of a few years. But it doesn't necessarily become his signature style. I think he sort of integrates it in the end. So the last image that I wanted to show you in terms of Sargent being a cultural chameleon is this one here. And I think this is a much beloved work for a lot of people. This is a painting that's called Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose. It dates to about 1885, and it's in the collection of the Tate in London. And when he first exhibited it, it was kind of criticized. It had a mixed reception, but people referred to it as having kind of a Frenchified style. So people still kind of thought he was working in this impressionist style at this point. But the way he executed this could not be more different than an impressionist who's sort of dashing things off really quickly, trying to get these momentary effects of light and shadow. Instead, Sargent decides he's very dedicated to capturing this effect of light, of sunlight at dusk. And you almost get the sense that it's the end of summer. It feels like a late August evening. You can basically hear the crickets chirping, right? So he wanted that kind of lavender kind of quality of light that you get right around this time in the evening. And so instead of just dashing that off in one night, what he did was he essentially painted for 2 to 3 minutes every night for about 3 months. So he really only worked when the light looked like this, and he labored over this. And of course, the end result is just absolutely stunning. You've got this sort of screen of flowers in front of you, and then the glow of the lanterns, these sweet young girls in their white dresses. There's just something supremely romantic about this, and just so lovely. The title, Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose, comes from a song that he would sing with his friends. Sort of interesting to think that he was staying at his friend's country house, and after he was done doing this painting, he would just run off and play tennis with them. But apparently at one point, he became a little frustrated with the whole process, and he started calling the picture Tarnation, Silly, Silly Pose. So there was a little bit of frustration there. So we're going to turn our attention to what he's best known for, and that is portrait painting. And our segment here is Friends in All the Right Places. But before we dive into that, does anybody have any burning questions at this point? Or if you'd like to share a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in. Let's see if I can try to answer it. All right. Okay. Well, we'll keep going. And of course, there will be time at the end too for any questions or comments. So we've got another gorgeous woman in a beautiful dress. Look at this dress. Doesn't it feel like you could just reach out and touch that red velvet? This is a portrait of Mrs. Hugh Hammersley from 1892. And this is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I love the quote here, portrait is a painting with something wrong with the mouth. So we get a sense, and I think this picture even sort of speaks to that idea. One critic, when this picture first debuted, said, the head literally vibrates with life. Never has the spirit of conversation been more actually and vividly embodied. So we get a sense that maybe he was engaged in great conversation with this particular model. So we have a sense that Sargent can adopt any style, and now he's really moving into grand manner portraiture with a little bit of Spanish Baroque and French Impressionism thrown in for good measure. Now, I just want to remind you sort of how unusual I think his portrait groupings are. Of course, they are stunning. They are beautiful. We have the Mrs. Vickers on the left from 1884, and then Mrs. Carl Meyer with her children from 1896. And with both of these pictures, of course, we've got these stunningly beautiful models in beautiful clothes. But again, as far as family portraits go, these are pretty unusual compositions, and these are pretty unusual poses to separate out one figure from a group like this, where there's two figures who are kind of close together like this, is unusual. And the image on the right is often joked about because the way he painted it, it almost looks as though this mother is kind of pushing her children back, as though she wished that they weren't quite in the composition. So, I'm referring to this as like grand manner portraiture. Here's an idea of what grand manner portraiture kind of looks like before John Singer Sargent. You didn't have these unusual compositions. There was still this emphasis on the family unit and bringing everybody together in the same way that we still do when we're taking family pictures. So he is doing something kind of unusual and kind of groundbreaking, despite the fact that he's working in this very traditional style at this point. So he becomes a very popular portrait painter. Here's a little cartoon of all the impressive ladies lined up outside of his Tite Street studio. Oop, that was his face sort of lurking in the window there. But everybody's, comes looking their best and hoping that he can make them look great too. So right around this time, we've got a sense of what Sargent looks like. He's a young man. He's got great personality, great work ethic. He's doing all of this himself. He is, as I mentioned before, he's multilingual, he's multi-talented, and he's got a lot of confidence. So he begins earning these really high-profile commissions, including US presidents. We've got Teddy Roosevelt on the left and Woodrow Wilson on the right. When he went to paint Roosevelt, he actually stayed and lived in the White House for about a month. And the two of them, there was a little bit of friction between them. He couldn't quite get Teddy Roosevelt to pose for him the way he had hoped. And Teddy Roosevelt was sort of bristling at the idea of sitting and posing. And so this picture sort of came about because Teddy Roosevelt kind of stormed down the stairs one day, put his hand on the newel post and turned around and sort of said, what do you want me to do? Sargent says, just hold that pose. There it is right there. And then eventually Teddy Roosevelt was admitted he was really delighted with the end result too. So we have US presidents, we have the White House, we also have this incredible house. And this is a house that many of you might be familiar with. This is the Biltmore Estate down in Asheville, North Carolina. This is, it was built for George Washington Vanderbilt II, and it is the largest privately owned residence in the United States. And so when it was built, John Singer Sargent was commissioned to paint portraits of the architect and the landscape architect. So you have William Morris Hunt on the left, and of course he's surrounded by the architecture of the building itself, and then Frederick Law Olmsted on the right, and he is surrounded by nature. Of course, everything at Biltmore when this was painted was just saplings, but Frederick Olmsted was the landscape architect that did Central Park and Prospect Park and the Emerald Necklace in Boston. So it's only appropriate that he is situated out in nature too. It's interesting, both of these men were sort of at the sort of near the end of their careers. They weren't in great health. These weren't considered necessarily Sargent's greatest portraits, but these are sort of unusual for his work because he's giving us so much information about who these kind of superstars in their fields really were. Richard Morris Hunt is famous for designing the breakers down in Newport, Rhode Island. He also did the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So these really were superstars, and Sargent was lucky to, be rubbing elbows with them essentially. Sargent also painted portraits of superstars from the art world. We already know that he was a friend and a fan of Claude Monet. So this is his portrait over here on the left of Claude Monet from 1887. On the right is Claude Monet's self-portrait from just a year earlier. So we get a sense that there is a real likeness, but a really sort of different approach here too. Obviously, he's not using that impressionist style in his portrait, and he has him posed in profile, almost as though he's like a president on a coin. Clearly, he really held Monet in high esteem. He also painted a superstar from the world of sculpture, and that is the sculptor Auguste Rodin, the French sculptor who's famous for creating the image of the thinker. And Rodin here is probably in sort of a mid-career, and I love this portrait because, again, there's this incredible directness. He's engaging us. He's got this sort of arched eyebrow, this big furry beard. But again, Sargent isn't really telling us in his portrait who this is. It was pretty unusual for him to give that kind of extra detail. So in addition to the arts, to politics, we also have literature. And John Singer Sargent painted this incredible portrait of Henry James in 1913. Henry James, the author of Wings of the Dove and Turn of the Screw, he'd been nominated for 2 Nobel Prizes in literature. So he's at the top of his game, and also frequently wrote about Sargent's work. And just to give you a sense of what Henry James looked like at the time, we get a sense that Sargent was very flattering in his portrait of him. He had the ability to make people look great. But he was trying to do innovative things too. So in this next portrait of another literary star, we see John Singer Sargent, again, kind of experimenting. And in this case, you be the judge if this is successful. What we're looking at here is a portrait of the author Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife. So we have the author of Treasure Island here. This is painted in 1885, and it's now in the collection of the Crystal Bridges Art Museum. And just to give you a sense of what Robert Louis Stevenson looked like in real life, here's a photograph. It's a very unusual composition that John Singer Sargent landed on. And as I understand it, if I'm remembering correctly, he painted the author several different times. But here we have, I mean, imagine if somebody said, I'm going to paint a portrait of you and your spouse, but your spouse is going to be sitting over on the edge of the canvas. They're going to be sort of shrouded in a scarf and looking away, and you're going to be walking away from them. And in between you will be an open door. I think it's the last way any of us would want to stage a composition of a picture of us with our spouses. But what Sargent apparently captured very well in this picture was Robert Louis Stevenson's very nervous qualities, that he was the kind of person that paced and sort of fidgeted a lot too. So we'll sort of end this section with one other really kind of brave compositional choice that Sargent made, and that is with this picture here, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd from 1882. And again, this is probably a favorite for many people because it's down at the MFA in Boston, and it's one that many of us have probably spent a lot of time with. So this is another picture where the compositional choice is very mysterious here, but perhaps absolutely brilliant. So we're looking at the 4 daughters of this one gentleman who was another expatriate, American expatriate living abroad. He was friends with Sargent. He was an artist in his own right. And Sargent has given us such an unusual presentation of his friend's children. And the way that this is often read is that it's almost as though he's showing us the different stages of development, where we have this very young child in the foreground who is unguarded and sort of interested in the stranger that is, well, not the stranger, in the person that is creating this picture. You can almost imagine that she's asking questions, that she's kind of engaged. The slightly older child, maybe she's 7, maybe she's 10, she is standing back with a little bit of apprehension. She's got her hands behind her back, but she's still willing to engage. And then you have the 2 older girls who are maybe, young teenagers, and they're withdrawn into the shadows. And then you have the oldest girl who's actually almost turning her back on the artist and us, the viewer. And so we sort of get a sense in terms of how children behave in these different stages of life, which seems very true to our own experiences. This was, and of course, if you've been to the MFA, you've probably seen it installed there with the actual giant vases that belong to the family. Apparently, these vases have traveled back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, I think 16 different times. It's amazing that they're still in one piece. I know that they've been damaged over the years. But one of the criticisms of this work is that Sargent sort of brought the vases to life and made the girls look a little bit cardboard. So you can be the judge of that. I think he did do something really brilliant with this picture, and it has been favorably compared to this masterwork by Diego Velázquez, certainly one of Sargent's heroes, who painted Las Meninas hundreds of years before this portrait of the Boyd daughters. But we still have, the dark shadows here and the young girl who's sort of interested and engaged with the viewer in the foreground. So a lot of different ideas about what's happening with Sargent, but let's talk about how we know him best, and that is through scandal. So the quote here is, "Every time I paint a portrait, I lose a friend." So we'll talk about some of his most scandalous works and then move a little quickly through some of those masterworks. The woman that we're looking at here, this is a painting that's in a private collection, but again, what a stunning work, right? A gorgeous dress. She's looking out at us directly. Her name is Madame Ramon Subercaseaux. And I just love the blue in that picture as well. It's just absolutely captivating. So one of Sargent's first works to really cause a scandal is one of his earliest ones. He painted this when he was just 25 years old. It's called Dr. Potsie at Home, painted in 1881. And it's the first time he's painted a large picture of a male subject. And he's a handsome guy, right? He is a doctor. But you could sort of easily mistake this as like an old painting of, somebody in the church, like a cardinal in this red robe. But then we realize that he's at home and it's kind of an informal dressing gown. There's kind of a speculation in the art history world that Sargent was sort of enthralled with this man. He was about 10 years Sargent's senior, and he was kind of a little bit of a playboy. He was a gynecologist and he was a surgeon. Sargent kind of focuses on his handsome face, but also on these very long fingers. And if you look closely at these fingers, his top hand almost looks as though it's holding his robe closed with a really sort of unusual gesture or configuration of the fingers. But then the bottom hand here is resting on the kind of rope belt, almost as though he's pulling it open. And art historians have sort of loved to talk about the provocative placement of these tassels in the front of the robe here. So none of this really aligns with the way that doctors typically dressed or presented themselves to the public. Here's a photo of the subject, Dr. Potsie. So this was a pretty provocative picture for the time. I also always think of it as kind of a painting pair with this other picture, Madame X. And I think I do because of that Sargent exhibition back at the MFA in the 1990s. I think they were sort of paired together. So of course, I think almost everyone has heard of Madame X, his most famous painting. She was 25, he was just 28 when he painted it. And it was done in 1884. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Madame X was an American expatriate who had married in France. And when I first learned about her, I always sort of thought of her, forgive the old reference, as like Paris Hilton. She was famous for being famous, and she was beautiful in sort of an unusual way. She was known for really powdering her skin to be so white, it was almost like lavender. So all these artists were kind of obsessed with her. Everybody wanted to paint her. One of Sargent's contemporaries even described stalking her like a deer. And Sargent ultimately wins this opportunity to paint a portrait of Madame Gautreau. And so he spends a year doing studies of her. And he described this process as taking so long because she was a, quote, unpaintable beauty and had hopeless laziness. So we see a lot of pictures of her lying around. And ultimately, he settles on this composition of Madame X, or Madame Gautreau, standing at this table, wearing this incredible dress with that no doubt has a whalebone corset built into it, gives her an incredible shape, and she turns her head to showcase this really sort of stunning profile that she has. And if you're familiar with the story of Madame X, you're familiar with the fact that he calls her that when the painting is exhibited. And when it's first exhibited, the strap of her dress is kind of falling off here. And that strap causes such a ruckus that Sargent ultimately has to repaint it. This was just considered so over the top and so sensual and so American in that way that Madame Gautreau was actually really humiliated by this. And Sargent was really surprised that his picture was received the way it was. And again, forgive me for the dated reference, but I think one way to sort of understand how this was received is Angelina Jolie in this black dress from the Oscars a few years back. She's already a beautiful woman with a stunning figure, but you'll remember she kept popping her leg out of this very high slit the entire time she was on the red carpet. And people just started making fun of the fact that she had to add another layer of sexuality by popping out her leg throughout the evening. So it was just considered just too over the top. And that's what we had with Madame Gautreau as well. And we can see the critics here sort of making fun of this dramatic silhouette in this case and her unusual profile. So Sargent, like I said, was kind of stunned by the reception. He ended up holding on to the portrait of Madame Gautreau for many years. And then in the end, actually, he held on to it for 36 years. And then in the end, he sold the painting to the Met, and he said to the director, I suppose it's the best thing I've ever done. So I think he was really proud of it, but he was pretty wounded by its reception. Madame Gautreau was painted by several other artists over the course of her life. Here's just a few of the other paintings. And I think, if given the chance and given the choice, I don't know, out of all these three, which artist or which painting would you prefer if you were her? I think I would probably stick with the Sargent painting. So that leads us to one of his final scandals, and that was right close by in Boston. And that involved Isabella Stewart Gardner, who we see in the photograph on the left. And this is Sargent's painting of her from 1888. Sargent was 32 when he painted it, and she was creeping up on 50 years old. She was 48 when this was painted. And the second I look at it, I can tell she's thinking of Madame X. She wants to be Madame X a little bit. And so he painted this portrait of her, and it was exhibited in Boston at the St. Botolph's Club. And it was so scandalous at the time that her husband asked that it never be displayed publicly again for the rest of his life. And she went beyond that. She never displayed it publicly again for the rest of her life, even though it was integrated into her museum. So what was scandalous about it? She's showing a lot of flesh. That's part of it. Women in those days would have been wearing gloves. There's sort of an ostentatious display of wealth with the pearl necklace, double strands around her waist. There's rubies sort of punctuating all of these necklaces. And then if you have really good eyes, rubies on her slippers too. But really the kicker was that she was standing in front of this tapestry that seemed to give her this halo effect and maybe even a little crown. And so critics at the time, wrote things like, who does she think she is? Some sort of Byzantine Madonna. And so of course, Isabella Stewart Gardner integrated this picture into her collection in the Gothic room, which is on the top floor of the museum. And it's a room that is filled with other Byzantine Madonnas. So it's a great placement. And like I said, she didn't make this room accessible to the public even during her lifetime, but she did allow John Singer Sargent to use this room as a place to paint other portraits. So her museum was very much sort of like a living, working studio for many artists. And here we see John Singer Sargent painting a portrait of Mrs. Fiske Warren. Her name was Gretchen Osgood, and her daughter Rachel. This was 1903. And the picture on the right is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts. Here's just sort of an outtake photograph where we see him kind of in action. And I love in the background, you can see that she's actually smiling. You don't ever see people in John Singer Sargent paintings actually smiling. So Sargent, we're going to turn our attention, gets away from portraiture and to some of his major works. And we'll do this pretty quickly because we can't, these are big projects and they're hard to cover in a short amount of time. But they do get him into a little bit more hot water. And of course, the beautiful woman in a beautiful dress that we see over here is Mrs. George Swinton from 1897. Again, just a stunning work, another stunning portrait. So a major work that Sargent was engaged with for almost 30 years is right nearby in Boston. And so of course we're looking at the Boston Public Library over here on the left. That's the exterior designed by Charles Follen McKinn, and the interior on the right, this sort of famous marble staircase with the lions there. So the library was founded in the 1850s, but this building was created and I think finished in 1895. And it was designed to be a palace for the people. So there were several rooms and halls where there were major murals that were commissioned by leading artists of the day. And John Singer Sargent earned the commission of this top floor gallery where he decided he would paint the subject of the triumph of religion. And I think Sargent sort of imagined that he would be creating America's version of the Sistine Chapel right in the Boston Public Library. So of course it's not as, it doesn't cover the same amount of square footage, but it is incredibly ambitious. Sargent would create these paintings in his studio. You can get a sense of how sort of small he was in comparison to some of these things. And he would escort them over to across the ocean to Boston and oversee their installation. And we're only seeing sort of a small segment of the works in the gallery. But this was a really ambitious project for him. And we'll just touch on just a few of these pictures just to show how complicated the imagery is. Because the subject here is religion, we have the Israelites at the center here being oppressed by a pharaoh and an Assyrian king. We have all this sort of coded iconography of art history in this kind of half moon shaped section. If we back away, we can see that underneath it is a row of prophets. And I want to focus actually on this kind of spandrel going that stretches across the top of the ceiling in this rounded area, because this is one of the most complicated and just beguiling pictures I've ever seen. So we're looking at it as though we're standing underneath it, and this would be the left wall and this would be the right wall. And so what I'm going to do is break it in half. And so this is the left wall over here, and this is the right wall. And so on one side, we have this like bovine-headed god who is like a reference to kind of the Egyptian past. There's even like a mummy figure down here, and we've got these little rays of light, these tiny hands reaching out from him. So we have a Sargent, using gold applique all over this installation. And then he counteracts that with this figure of this woman in this blue diaphanous gown. And she's like another kind of goddess over here, sort of balancing it all out. And then if we go back to that original picture, here we have the bovine headed, here we have this beautiful ethereal goddess. Everything's united by the face and figure of this kind of dark figure here who stretches from top to bottom, who is representing the universe. We've got, elements of the zodiac here, the suggestion of the night sky. So it's incredibly complicated and ambitious and gorgeous. But what gets Sargent into hot water is sort of the other section of this mural cycle, where he's talking about Christianity. He has two sort of paired pictures here, and then we'll notice that the central panel is missing. And the reason for that is the picture that he has for Christianity here is a Pietà picture with the Madonna and dead Christ at her feet. And it's paired with an image that Sargent referred to or called synagogue. And this is what got him into hot water. What we see here is sort of a temple collapsing on a female figure. And this was seen as very anti-Semitic. People in Boston were really upset about it. Actually, somebody threw a vial of ink at it, and Sargent really defended it. He was, again, sort of taken aback that it was causing any sort of strife. He showed that he was referencing the Sistine Chapel with this, this figure over here on the right. And in the end, it was just something where, again, he was kind of licking his wounds and didn't really understand the commotion that it caused, but ultimately he did not finish the cycle or the series. That is not to say that he didn't have major works that were successful. He did other murals and that sort of thing. Very quickly, I just wanted to show you one of his major works that was considered a huge success. What we're looking at here is a picture that's called Gassed, and it is about 20 feet long. It gives you a sense of the scale here. He painted this in 1919, and it was voted the picture of the year by the Royal Academy of Arts. It's in the Imperial War Museum in the UK. And what we're looking at, facing it directly, is a column of soldiers from World War I who were hit by mustard gas. So it's an incredible picture showing us kind of the effects of war, not just the dead, but the people who survive it and are blinded. And in this case, it's a picture of like the blind leading the blind, and you can see another column of soldiers, and they're all kind of making their way to a medical tent that is just sort of outside the frame of this picture. And then, of course, the rest of the picture, we're kind of littered with all of these bodies of these poor soldiers who have been blinded during war. And it's this kind of reminder of the horrific things that can happen during a war, and the tragedies that extend beyond just losing lives, and how war can impact people in such profound ways. So this was considered a real success for him, but Sargent decides he is turning his attention away from major works and from portraits, even though we've got another lovely portrait of a lovely woman in a beautiful dress. This is Millicent, Duchess of Sutherland. He says, "I hate to paint portraits. I hope I never have to paint another portrait in my life." So clearly he's done. So I want to show you his watercolors, just a few of them. Like I said, he painted over 2,000 of them. When he was an official war artist, he got very accustomed to working outside in small easels under an umbrella. This is a cartoon of him doing just that, and a photograph of him later on in life doing it as a watercolorist. And so what he would do was he dug deep into that nomadic lifestyle, and he traveled everywhere with a group of friends and family, and he would paint images like the ones that you see here. This is Florida on the left and Maine on the right. He was going all over the US and all over the world, really, and capturing these incredible scenes. Here are his friends and family. They would oftentimes just kind of pile up on the ground and just kind of entertain themselves, and he would paint pictures of them. But I want to kind of focus on how, again, this kind of virtuoso technique that he has. As an oil painter, he would load up paint on his brush and then just apply it directly to canvas. And I think you can sort of see the same ideas at play with watercolor. And, you know, to some degree, he's loading his brush with water too. But I love an image like this. It's called Corfu. This is in the collection of the MFA as well. Beautiful colors here. I love the way he's just using this kind of fuchsia and the teals to suggest the shadows here, and then the play of the shadow of the tree on the architecture here. He tends to kind of pair strict architecture with these fluid flowing lines. And so I just wanted to share a few of his images from Venice, which are probably his best known and most celebrated watercolor pictures. So I won't even get into like which specific ones these are, but just sort of allow all of us to be dazzled by the way he's painting, you know, the water in the canals, the effect of sunlight off of the water, the way he sort of lays in the architecture in the background, gives us a great deal of structure that way, but then just allows for that empty white space right there in the center of the picture, while obviously allowing for more fluidity with the brushwork as we get towards the foreground. Beautiful blues throughout, and he's really credited with creating that kind of underdrawing to best describe the architecture of Venice. And then this last image here of the white boats is hands down one of my favorite of his watercolors. I love the way he's described the water here with these short broken brush strokes, and that extends up to the rigging on all of these boats here. I'm not even sure if this is Venice, to be honest. This is painted in about 1908, 1909, and it's in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And there's just something about this picture for me that really just transports you to being on a boat and feeling like you're right there with him while he was painting it. So we'll wrap up thinking about John Singer Sargent's legacy. And I love our quote here. He says, I don't dig beneath the surface for things that don't appear before my own eyes. And this is really what gets him into trouble in terms of his legacy. And of course, another beautiful woman here. His legacy, sort of starts turning against him even before he dies. One of the last oil paintings that he did is right up in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I am tonight. And this is Grace Elvina, the Marchioness Curzon of Kettleston. This is painted in 1925, the year that he died. And she looks like she's straight out of Downton Abbey, right? She's got this very regal pose, an incredible dress, pearls for days. But this was considered really out of step with what American artists in particular were painting around that time, or even European artists. So you have works here by Picasso and Edward Hopper and Kandinsky, all painted around the same time. And so you have artists who are exploring abstraction and realism, and like a gritty realism in the case of Hopper at this time. And so grand manner portraiture just seems really kind of out of step with where the art world is. So just a few years after Sargent dies, the art critic Louis Mumford says Sargent remained to the end an illustrator, the most adroit appearance of workmanship, the most dashing eye for effect, cannot conceal the essential emptiness of Sargent's mind, or the contemptuousness and cynical superficiality of a certain part of his execution. So by the mid 20th century, 1952, Sargent's oil paintings were selling for less than $300 at auction. He had really fallen out of favor. And Norman Rockwell sort of captures this kind of cultural shift in this 1966 painting for Look magazine, where we see a museum setting and a housewife with her daughter kind of examining a John Singer Sargent grand manner portrait painting. But it's really the cool young woman, the young artist with her sketchbook looking at Picasso that's really showing us the future in this picture. So, I mean, this is painted in the 60s when it's all about, you know, the civil rights movement and the women's movement. And this is really showing what the past is and what the future is. So things kind of start to change in terms of how we think of Sargent's work. You have Andy Warhol saying, Sargent made everybody look glamorous, taller, thinner, but they all have mood. Every one of them has a mood. And I think this picture here on the right, this is Miss Helen Dunham. She definitely has a mood here. So we begin to see right around the 1990s, the turn of the century again, a renewed interest in Sargent. So the Robert Louis Stevenson painting that sold in 2004 for $8.8 million to Crystal Bridges, the image that we have here on the right, which is a group with parasols from 1905, this sold for $23.5 million. So obviously going up in auction prices. And then you have these blockbuster exhibitions. The Summer of Sargent at the MFA, the last weekend that the show was on view, they had round-the-clock admission. It toured the National Gallery and the Tate, and I think it brought in close to 100, a million people total just to see John Singer Sargent's work. So critics today still sort of talk about how complicated these images are, and they talk about how this renewed interest is sort of related to the fact that we're in our own Gilded Age today. So I've paired this Sargent painting of an interior in Venice with a portrait of Ivanka Trump's family, because it reminded me of one critic who recently wrote, "The appeal, nay the point, of Sargent is beauty, extravagance, and the visual representation of social hierarchy." So I don't want to leave that as our last note here, because when I think of Sargent, and this is our last image for the night, what I think of is fantasy and escape. I think the images are just so beautiful. They're devoid of work, they're devoid of conflict or strife of any kind. They're almost like a century-old version of Instagram in some way. It's the most beautiful version of the world that we can imagine. So an image like this of a girl on a rooftop in Capri just allows us to step outside of real life and real existence and imagine a world of total beauty. That's what Sargent, I think, gives us so well. So we'll end there. I'm sorry I went a little bit late, but there was so much to cover. I welcome any questions or comments that anybody has at this point. And I'll start looking through these chats too. Let's see. If anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to unmute yourself too.
Yes, lots of great compliments coming in, Jane. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Hope you enjoyed the images. How could you not, right?
No, it was really beautiful. What an excellent collection. Just had so much fun. Haleo is one of my favorites as well.
That one just stunning. I love that one. It's incredible. Yeah.
We have one question here from Karen. Karen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask? I don't see that. I can't get the chat again.
Well, I do see the question is, did he work mostly from his Tite Street studio in London? And that's a really good question. I don't have in my mind sort of the mental map of how he moved around and where he spent the most amount of time, because he certainly spent a lot of time in London and also in Paris. I think those were like the two main hubs, and clearly he went to Venice a lot now that I'm thinking about it, but I think Tite Street was probably a primary spot for him in terms of his work, but I can't tell you definitively how much time he spent there. But good question.
And then another one just came in. Why did he work so much in Boston, or what made Boston so important to him?
That is a good question. I know his father was born in Gloucester, so there might have just even been some family connections that brought him back. But I think that there were a lot of Bostonians like Isabella Stewart Gardner who were doing the grand tour and spending a lot of time in Europe and meeting with him there, and they were able to kind of lure him back to Boston to do not only the Boston Public Library, but also a cycle of murals at the Museum of Fine Arts too. So he did a lot of work in Boston. Somebody else asked, does the MFA have many of his works? And they absolutely do. They have a great online collection too, so you can just type in his name and see all the works that they have. Oil paintings, in addition to the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, and then also a number of just gorgeous watercolors too. I was trying to find some that represented Maine because I know that he spent a lot of time there, but I'm not sure. I don't think that the MFA has any of those, but all of the watercolors are just stunning anyways, yes. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. Feel free to send me a note or a message via my website, iamculturallycurious.com, if there's anything that comes to you after the fact, or connect on Facebook. Again, I really appreciate everybody spending their evening with me, and I hope it was an enjoyable one for you. So thank you, everyone.